I ended up in the hospital, and while everyone kept telling me to rest, my heart refused to calm down until it heard something, anything from you. I ended up in the hospital, and I kept replaying your voice in my head just to feel safe, because somehow your comfort runs deeper than any medicine they could give me. I ended up in the hospital, and even though the room was full of people, I felt painfully alone because the one person I needed wasn't there. You. I ended up in the hospital, and I hated how weak I felt, but I hated even more how much I longed to hear your voice. I ended up in the hospital, and the moment fear hit me, your name was the first thing my heart whispered, as if you were the only anchor. I had left. I ended up in the hospital, and with every breath I took, all I could think about was how different everything feels when you're not beside me. I ended up in the hospital, and the silence of the room made me realize how much your presence kept me sane all this time. I ended up in the hospital, and even though the pain was real, the thought of losing connection with you hurt even more. I ended up in the hospital, and the first thing I wished for wasn't medicine or comfort. It was a message from you. I ended up in the hospital, and it terrified me that your voice was the only thing capable of calming my shaking heart. I ended up in the hospital, and I felt every beat of my heart asking the same question. Do you even know how much I need you? I ended up in the hospital, and while the doctors worked around me, all I could imagine was you holding my hand and telling me everything would be okay. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized how deep my feelings run because you're the first person I wanted to hear from, not out of habit, but out of love. I ended up in the hospital, and I kept staring at my phone, hoping your name would show up just once, just long enough to make me breathe easier. I ended up in the hospital, and the truth hit me. If anything happened to me, the biggest regret would be not telling you how much you mean to me. I ended up in the hospital, and your absence echoed louder than the monitors, louder than the pain, louder than everything. I ended up in the hospital, and I felt this strange kind of emptiness because the one person I wanted to comfort me wasn't even here. I ended up in the hospital, and even though everyone tried to reassure me, none of it mattered because it wasn't your voice I was hearing. I ended up in the hospital, and I didn't care about the diagnosis. I cared about whether you still cared enough to ask how I was. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized how fragile life is. But even more fragile was my hope of hearing from you. I ended up in the hospital, and I hated how every thought circled back to you, even when I tried to focus on anything else. I ended up in the hospital, and when fear crept in, the only comfort I could imagine was hearing you say my name softly. I ended up in the hospital, and all I wanted was to feel your presence, the way it always steadies me without trying. I ended up in the hospital, and my biggest fear wasn't the pain. It was the possibility that you might not show up in my life anymore. I ended up in the hospital, and somehow, even the coldest moments felt warmer when I imagined you beside me. I ended up in the hospital, and I kept thinking about how different everything feels when you're not the one holding my worries. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized how deeply I rely on you, not for attention, but for peace. I ended up in the hospital, and every minute I waited for your message felt like another reminder of how much you mean to me. I ended up in the hospital, and I couldn't escape the truth. Your voice is the one thing I trust more than any doctor's reassurance. I ended up in the hospital, and even with all the noise around me, the loudest thing in my heart was your absence. I ended up in the hospital, and I kept wondering whether you'd think about me, even for a second, the way I couldn't stop thinking about you. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized that no matter how hard life hits me, you're the person my heart runs to first. I ended up in the hospital, and the emptiness in the room made me crave your warmth more than anything else. I ended up in the hospital, and it scared me how badly I wanted to hear you say, "I'm here." I ended up in the hospital, and the thought of you not knowing made everything feel 10 times heavier. I ended up in the hospital, and even though people came to see me, none of them filled the void your voice would have filled instantly. I ended up in the hospital, and the longer I stayed, the more obvious it became. You're not just someone I care about, you're someone I emotionally depend on. I ended up in the hospital, and I kept imagining you walking through the door, worried, angry, soft, anything, as long as it was you. I ended up in the hospital, and the moment they told me to rest, all I could think about was your voice. Because somehow you're the only one who makes the world feel less terrifying. I ended up in the hospital, and even though everyone kept asking me who I wanted to call, it was only your name that formed in my mind, like my heart didn't know anyone else existed. I ended up in the hospital, hooked to machines, and surrounded by noise. But all I craved was one simple thing, your presence, because your comfort hits deeper than medicine. I ended up in the hospital, staring at the ceiling, realizing how fragile everything is, and yet the only thing that felt certain was how badly I wanted to hear from you. I ended up in the hospital, and even while nurses moved around me, all I felt was the ache of missing your voice, because somehow you became my calm in every crisis. I ended up in the hospital, and nothing scared me more than the possibility of you not knowing, of you not caring, of you not reaching out when I needed you the most. I ended up in the hospital, and it broke me how natural it felt to want you there beside me, as if your presence was the only medicine I trusted. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized something painful. You're the person I run to even when I can't physically run, because my heart doesn't know where else to go. I ended up in the hospital, lying there quietly, and every beat of my heart whispered your name like it was the only thing keeping me awake. I ended up in the hospital, and all I wanted was the sound of you saying, "You're here, you're staying, and you're not letting me face this alone." I ended up in the hospital, and everything hurt except the thought of you. Because the thought of you has always been the one thing that heals me. I ended up in the hospital, and the fear hit me so fast, but then your name hit me even harder, reminding me who I trust more than anyone. I ended up in the hospital, and as the doctor spoke, all I could imagine was your hand in mine, steadying me the way nothing else ever does. I ended up in the hospital, but the real ache wasn't the pain. It was not knowing if you'd show up, if you'd care, if I still meant anything to you. I ended up in the hospital, And the moment I opened my eyes, I wished it was your face I'd see first, because somehow you became the person I long for in every dark moment. I ended up in the hospital, and it hit me how deeply I needed you when my first instinct wasn't to call anyone else, not family, not friends, just you. I ended up in the hospital, and the loneliness swallowed me. But the thought of hearing your voice became the first flicker of hope I'd felt all day. I ended up in the hospital, and it terrified me how quickly life can change. But even more terrifying was imagining you not being part of mine anymore. I ended up in the hospital, and every beep of the machine sounded like a reminder of how fragile I am. Yet your name kept me grounded like nothing else. I ended up in the hospital, and your absence felt louder than the monitors, sharper than the pain, heavier than the room itself. I ended up in the hospital, and I realized that if this was the moment everything changed, I'd still only want to hear you say my name one more time. I ended up in the hospital, and even though I tried to stay strong, my heart betrayed me by whispering your name over and over like a prayer. I ended up in the hospital, and the fear of losing everything mattered less than the thought of losing you. I ended up in the hospital, and suddenly all my unresolved feelings for you came crashing back. Louder and clearer than ever, I ended up in the hospital, and I hated how much I needed you, but I needed you more than the air around me. I ended up in the hospital, and the moment I closed my eyes, I wished it was your voice waking me up. I ended up in the hospital, and every painful second made me want you more, miss you more, and hope for you more. I ended up in the hospital, and somehow, even with all the chaos, the only thing my heart repeated was your name. I ended up in the hospital, but the scariest part wasn't the pain. It was wondering whether you still cared enough to reach out. I ended up in the hospital, and the only thing that gave me strength was imagining you walking into the room, looking at me with worry in your eyes. I ended up in the hospital, realizing that the people who matter show up, and the person I wanted to show up was always you. I ended up in the hospital, and in that moment of weakness, I finally understood how deeply I've fallen for you. I ended up in the hospital, and even though I tried to distract myself, the only thing my mind went back to was how much I needed your warmth. I ended up in the hospital, and suddenly every argument, every distance, every silence felt so small compared to the ache of wanting you there.